I've been a sex and relationships writer and educator for going on 30 years now, and the more I do it, the less those divisions make sense to me.
But I mean, we have to start somewhere with language and describing things. The way that I do poly is not going to be the same as like I have multiple loves, it counts as poly, but that's not the same as somebody who's got their 3 wives right now and they're like living in a compound in like Utah or something. That's still poly. Yeah. That counts.
As long as everybody's in it consensually.
Right, well.
That is an important distinction.
That is an important distinction.
I often don't think that religious polygyny is under the polyamory umbrella. I think it's under the non-monogamy umbrella, personally.
And once again, we have 2 umbrellas.
Is it raining?
Yeah,
I think it's raining in here. It's raining words.
As far as I'm concerned, if you're opening yourself to sex, whatever that means to you, romance, whatever that means to you, and love, whatever that means to you, with more than one person, then you belong here. And it does not make much sense to start. It's not like there's so many of us in the world that have opened ourselves up to this kind of thinking that we can afford to sort ourselves out. It's kind of better to find what we have in common. And I have plenty in common with the Mormon guy with his 3 wives. We're all trying to find ways to take care of loving multiple people.
I find that I have more in common with people that are in open relationships than closed relationships. It's harder for me to relate to the mentality of any type of closed. And I don't mean 2 people closed. I mean any number of people closed. Could be 12 closed. And it's a mentality that I can't fully relate to personally, because it's just, like, I would never enter into that level of closed relationship, but I've done it temporarily. You know, there's sometimes where 3 or 4 months or 1 month or whatever, where it's like, I better just settle down with what I got, because it's already messy. And
getting a little too busy.
Yeah, and so I'm just gonna like close it down for an era, but I'm definitely gonna open it up later.
I don't want to make it seem like there is not stuff to be talked about when different people want different things out of a relationship, which can happen. As a writer and a writing teacher, I'm constantly encouraging people to use your verbs. Verbs are really good parts of language. If you want to make your writing better, use better verbs and it'll just go up 200% overnight. But also in talking about ourselves and what we do. Instead of talking, I am a relationship anarchist, say, I don't like to make promises to people about what the future of our relationship would be. I don't do well prioritizing certain people's needs over other people's needs. I like to make different agreements with different people as the relationship dictates, and I like to revisit those agreements every now and again to make sure that they're still growing with us. Those are all verbs, and I did not have to call myself an anything. I just talked about what I like. I don't like having genital sex with anybody but my spouse. That's not in fact the case, but for many people it is. The very first time Dossie and I ever spoke about poly, it was when we were talking about doing Ethical Slut, and we often start such a project by trying to do a workshop or 2 and seeing what people want to know. And so as we were getting started, I said, can I have a show, this was in a BDSM environment, can I have a show of hands of everybody in this room who considers themselves monogamous? And 2 hands went up, one of which belonged to a woman in whom I had had my personal fist the night before. Obviously, I am not going to out her in front of the room, but I took her aside afterwards and said, okay, this is not a definition of monogamy with which I'm familiar, but it turned out that her and her spouse, they only had penis-vagina intercourse with one another, and that was their monogamy. So it's not like everybody who is using relationship anarchy or monarchy or mono-amory or whatever your word is means the same thing. You have to go to the verbs before you find out what's really going on.
I'm gonna coin polyfisterous right now.
Polyfisterous, you bet.
To talk about the little paradigm shift, and that's I think what it is, the paradigms of these different relationships, it's just different mindsets. And so like if I'm on a different paradigm as somebody else, like we can find similarities and we can work with each other, but like if we're not talking about it and we're just making assumptions about what the other person is doing, things are just gonna go really wrong really quickly. It's very important, for example, to have low expectations for my attention span because I don't have one. And if you have high expectations, such as me watching vacation video for like an hour, then I'm not going to be a very good participant in this activity. And so just like gauging your partner's ability to follow through on the promises that they give, and maybe also having a conversation with them about what promises they make will help you to arrange like a compromise between the different paradigms to the point where you can deal with somebody else. And sometimes you can't, but sometimes you can.
Where the mistake gets made often, I'm sure many of us have seen our monogamous friends' relationships go south because they both, when they decided to get together, they said, I'm monogamous, cool, so am I, as though that were the end of the conversation. And it turns out that for A, jerking off to porn is not part of a monogamy agreement, and to B, it is. You've got to get to the verbs.
I'd also like to make a distinction on the word anarchy and how it's inherently difficult to define because every anarchist says, fuck your definition. Like, that's kind of the point.
Yeah.
Like, there's like, you could get to like, are we gonna get to relationship nihilism next? You know, where I don't believe in anything? I mean, I think that might be a movement at some point.
I'm gonna get behind it. I'm behind
Relationship
it.
nihilism, right? And so I recently had this debate ad nauseum about trying to define relationship anarchy, and we found it impossible to get 10 people to agree on what relationship anarchy actually means. It was impossible. So
anytime you're trying to define something by what it's not, you've got a problem, and that's kind of the core problem of relationship anarchy.
To your point, I really believe that all of these words are conversation starters, not conversation enders. And all it's gonna do is, you know, you're probably not going to have a traditional monogamy person trying to define your relationship anarchy in a way that you're gonna like. And so you're gonna end up figuring it out, what do these words mean to us? And it helps to have like a list, a glossary, it helps, but even then you're gonna read that 3 sentences and interpret them differently.
Back in the early days with the book, I used to get calls all the time from TV producers, and the conversation was always, can you point me toward a poly family that are not either old hippies or screaming geeks? And my answer was, no. I mean, A, that you've just described my social circles pretty accurately, and B, there just aren't. But now you look at this group, and some of you probably are one of those two things, but others of you don't seem to be. And it's become a much more mainstream possibility than it was 20 years ago.
I think we're also entering an era, to quote 4chan and Chris Poole, oddly enough, of that we are all a diamond with multi-facets, and that we show different facets of ourselves at different times to different people. And we're getting into an era where there is no such thing as in or out of the closet. It's who are you in or out to, and how much and where and why and all these things. And all of that complexity makes it hard to answer that question. The answer is that it has changed. That's the answer. But it's so many ways for so many different parts of the country. LA, Oregon, New York City, Kansas, there's gonna be massive differences, even locally, the BDSM scene versus the burner scene versus the swinger scene versus, you know, it's like everything is changing and changed. That's my answer to that question.
Another factor as well, when I speak to millennial audiences on college campuses, there are always second generation, in one case even third generation poly people in the audience. So it's going to be real interesting to see where these kids who have not had to swim upstream against a lot of negative conditioning, where they can take this. I don't know where it's going to go from here.
I only know of a handful of people over 30 that are second generation, that are born of poly and non-monogamous parents. But that doesn't mean that there's only a handful, because a lot of parents don't tell their kids, especially in previous generations. Grandma's probably not going to talk about being a swinger around World War II. She's just probably not going to do it.
I didn't find out for years that I had been babysitting for the kids next door while my folks were wife swapping with the people next door. But I was.
And to further what I just said, they're probably not going to tell you about all the cheating they did either. Like, whose grandmother is going to sit you down? What grandpa is going to say, yeah, I cheated 30 times on grandma? That doesn't happen. Those conversations don't happen. So we don't know how wild our parents really were. Some of us do. Some of us do.
Because I don't insist on being perceived for who I am by strangers, I don't run across a lot of the issues that Morgan might, or, people ask me what pronouns I prefer, and I say, she is just fine unless we're fucking, in which case I would strongly prefer he, thank you very much. And since we're usually not at that time, then we stick with she. But I'm someone who has always been strongly drawn. My first crushes were on obvious gay men on television back before we knew they were gay men. Dr. Smith on the Lost in Space show. Very few of you are old enough to remember, but he was a huge crush of mine early on. It was one of the things that bound me to my spouse. Was he was telling me that when he was that age, he made his mother take him to J.C. Penney's to get a velour shirt with a dickie so that he could be like Dr. Smith. That's a relationship made in heaven. I think a lot of people think genderqueer is only for young people. And so I'm happy to stand and say, old.
A lot of people think sex is only for young people.
Well, that's true. And I'm not having sex, but I'm still genderqueer.
It depends on how you define. It depends on how you define sex.
It's true. It does depend on how you define sex. Anyways, so it's. I was telling Wry last night, I really think gender is a tectonic shift in the culture that compares to the summer of love stuff that was when I was young. It is changing everything in ways that we're only beginning to see. And I'm really thrilled to find out what's going to come of that.
I think that is what is totally true. I think a second revolution is happening, a sexual revolution, and I think it's largely the fault and responsibility of social media. I think Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and all of it, all the social media channels that are out there. Without that, that's how we communicate and create culture. And you passed on a brilliant thesis to me that I read that was about a subject that's rarely talked about. It was the domestic discipline culture.
Yeah, wasn't that fascinating?
Absolutely fascinating, and I'll pass it on to you if I'm allowed to legally. And it's in contrast to the BDSM community, and yet so much overlap, but there's differences. And I would never have known that prior to email, prior to social media. There's so much that we're exposed to because the world has become narrowcasting rather than broadcasting, including this conversation right now. This would not have been shot on TV 20 years ago. Wouldn't happen, but it's going on YouTube. It's going in the documentary. It's changing the world.
As long as we're talking about the things that I see on social media, I might as well mention that gender is a conversation that's happening in laws as well. There was just recently in the news a thing about North Carolina. They removed things that would let people who look like me go to the bathroom. That sucks. So as long as we're talking about social media, those are the things that people see now that nobody had the time to look into before. And now it just takes a couple of activists who are realizing what things are happening in their hometown before the whole world hears about it.
Apparently Buck Angel is off to North Carolina to pee in women's bathrooms.
All right, guys, road trip.
God bless
God
Buck
bless him.
Angel.
Yeah.